let's start with the prompt. Which choice most logically completes the text here? That's one of our tougher prompts because we need to understand the text well enough to be able to predict what might follow it. So let's start reading. These Puebloans, the civilization from which present-day Pueblo tribes descended, emerged as early as 1500 BC in an area of what is known as southwestern US and dispersed suddenly in the 1200 CE, which, by the way, is more recent, abandoning established villages with systems for farming crops and turkeys. Recent analysis comparing Turkey remains at Mesa Verde, one such village, to samples from modern turkey populations in this Rio Grande Valley, determined that the latter birds descended in part from turkeys cultivated at Mesa Verde, with shared genetic markers appearing only after 1280. Thus, researchers concluded. So, starting to analyze this a little bit, we have this civilization emerged in this year and dispersed in the late 1200s, abandoning their villages that had systems for farming crops and turkeys. They analyzed the turkey remains, and they found that the latter birds, the birds that were from Rio Grande Valley of central New Mexico, descended from the Mesa Verde birds, which is a different location, and they found shared markers only after 1280. So you can imagine that after 1280, the people migrated from one area to the other because they're seeing the shared genetic markers in the turkey remains, but it's only happening after a certain year. So they migrated from the, from the Mesa Verde to the Rio Grande Valley where the remains were later found. So let's look at the answers. A, conditions of the remains in Rio Grande and Mesa Verde had greater similarities in the past than they do today. There was no comparison of whether them being more similar in the past in terms of finding the evidence and all that. B, some Pueblans migrated to Rio Grande in the late 1200s and carried farming practices with them. Well, that makes sense because we saw that they were migrating from Mesa Verde to Rio Grande. C, indigenous people living in the Rio Grande primarily planted crops and did not cultivate turkeys. That wasn't up for the debate. We know they cultivated turkeys. D, the Puebloans likely adopted the farming practices of indigenous peoples living in other regions. There was no mention of people from other regions. It was only a comparison of these two areas. So the answer that made sense was B, because we see them migrating from Rio Grande, which is what we saw, over to the Mesa Verde, and they carried their farming practices with them. In other words, the turkeys. So the answer here is B.